Welcome to Renegade Thinkers Unite, featuring the sharpest minds in marketing, inspirational case histories, and weekly insights you can apply to your business. Find out why top CMOs rank this podcast among their favorites. Now, here's your host, Chief Marketing Renegade, Drew Nizer.
Hey, it's Drew, and I'm with Noah Brier. Now, Noah and I have known each other since 2004. That was 15 years ago. And this episode is about all that can happen in 15 years. It's kind of amazing. So, Noah, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, back in 2004, I get a call from what I thought was a reporter for like American Demographics. I didn't know you were a student at the time. I get a call, and you're doing a story on Shepard Fairey, who was of the Obey Giant fame, and at that time, Renegade was sort of known as a guerrilla marketing agency. So tell me, how did you even become a reporter for American Demographics as a college student?
Sure, yeah. So I was at NYU, and I got to meet the editor of American Demographics somehow. I think it was through my dad. And I pitched him a story. I said, he said, "What are you interested in?" And I said, "Well, I've been tracking this guy, Shepard Fairey. I've been tracking Obey Giant, and I'm kind of interested in how sort of brands can emerge from weird cultural things." And so he said, "Okay, cool. Well, that sounds pretty interesting. And why don't you write me 2,500 words, and I'll pay you for it. And if it's good enough, I'll hire you. And if it's bad enough, I'll give you the money. And then you'll go find a different job. And you probably won't be a writer." And so I wrote my 2,500 words. It was an amazing experience. I called Shepard Fairey. I spoke to Cause, who is now a big artist as well. You see him on all the Uniqlo shirts and everywhere else. I spoke to you. I spoke to a bunch of other people, and one, it was just amazing because everybody will answer your call when you're writing a story. But two, I got to write this amazing story, and then it got accepted. It got into the magazine. I met you. I wrote for American Demographics for a while, and then eventually our paths merged again when American Demographics went out of business.
Oh, right. That's how it happened. So the funny part of it was I remember Fanny, who was the creative director at Renegade at the time, said, "Remember that kid who interviewed you? Well, he's actually a pretty talented writer." And I said, "Wait, what?" She said, "You ought to bring him in." And so I went, "Okay." And that was pretty an amazing thing. And first of all, when I think back that you as a college student could write something as well written as that is impressive. So we knew there was something there early on. So you get to Renegade, and you said in your note you didn't know what a copywriter was? Talk to me. Come on.
I didn't know what a copywriter was. I didn't know much about the marketing or advertising industry other than what I had reported on. And so, I figured I knew how to write, and everybody seemed to think that I could do the job, and so I was comfortable with it. But no, I didn't know exactly what a copywriter meant. I didn't know what I would be doing precisely, but, it felt like a good place. It had a good vibe, and I liked all the people. And I figured, writing is writing at the end of the day, and if you can do it, you can do it.
All right, and you did do it.
Yeah.
And so what do you think? So this is a little were there some things that you remember from your experience at Renegade that any stories or anything that you should share here with the audience?
Sure, yeah. There's a bunch of things I remember. There's people I met at Renegade who I still see often. I was just out in California, and I saw a guy, Charles, who we worked with back in 2005. So there were some amazing people there, many of whom I still keep in touch with. I think that what was really amazing about the place was just the variety of work that we were doing at that time. I think it's a lot more common now to think sort of multimodally, but I don't think it was actually happening that much. We were doing digital work, we were doing experiential work, we were doing video work, we were doing all of these different things, and we were just sort of melding them together without worrying about it. It wasn't like we needed to call it something or something else. It was just sort of like, of course you should do all these things if you're doing marketing.
Well, it was fun to not be constrained by that thing. I always thought, however, in retrospect, that focus is your friend, and I just wondered, had we just done one thing, right? And that was the problem. But my problem was I have extreme ADD, and I'm too interested in too many parts of marketing to just sort of settle on one. And it's too hard because if you see a solution for a client that doesn't include exactly what you do, what do you do? Say, you ought to do this, but let someone else do it? So anyway, we figured it out. Okay, so along the way, you had a bunch of other experiences before you founded Percolate. Talk a little bit about some of the things that each of those places taught you before you started Percolate.
Sure, yeah. I think staying at Renegade for 1 second, because there were sort of two other big things that before I left. I think one, I was starting to experiment with doing some side projects, and so I started a thing called Like Mind while I was at Renegade, which was a coffee meetup. I just invited some folks. I did it along with peers from PSFK, and it was a sort of amazing experience because all these amazing people came, and eventually it was in sort of 40 or 50 cities around the world, and it was in the New York Times, and it just sort of gave me a taste for trying to do things and just seeing what happens. The other thing that happened at Renegade, which really sort of like set me on my next path, was that it was a place where I could explore a lot of things. So I wrote copy, but I also got to do a little bit of creative direction. I got to work on new business, and I also got to work on some strategy. And in doing that and working with Ted, who we both remember well from Renegade, I got to sort of experience strategy, and I got really interested in it. I got really interested in the ideas around marketing strategy, and I left Renegade to go to a place called Naked Communications, which was focused on doing strategy. So it sort of solved that problem that we were just talking about kind of what should you do by saying, hey, actually maybe strategy should exist as this sort of independent piece that works across all channels that then doesn't produce any of the work and works with all of these agencies. I can tell you from experience that model has a whole bunch of flaws in and of itself.
I was going to say,
but it was also great fun, and it was super interesting.
Right.
And I think the biggest thing I learned there that I took from the place was about what strategy does and how it works, and really the idea that strategy is an attempt to codify ways of working. Right? And so one of the things we used to produce was a thing we called the communications architecture, which looked at a customer journey, and it aligned messages against a journey. And it was a really, I thought, sort of important way to communicate what strategy should do within an organization. But more importantly, it did it in a way that people could actually use it. Right? And one of my big pet peeves is that strategy so often is just words on a page. And people forget that the whole point of doing strategy in any organization, but especially in marketing, is to help people make better marketing. Make better content. And making that actionable, connecting it back, putting it in a place where you can see it and codifying it in a way that makes it easy for everyone to use, I think was the sort of single biggest lesson I took away from there. And it's something that I definitely moved into Percolate as I built it out.
I want to jump on that because I was reading about that, and in fact, I wrote down that quote that you said, if strategy doesn't inform action, it's probably not strategy. And I have sort of felt over the last couple of years, and I almost call it branding malpractice, when a branding firm gives you a positioning but doesn't give you the articulation of it that you can use externally. And the reason why I focus on the external expression of the strategy is it's easier for people to wrap their minds around, right? And I did a podcast recently where I mentioned where family comes first. That idea expressed that way would have been very easy for Family Circle to understand, okay, this is our marching orders for everything we do. Now, they didn't do it because we didn't have a process behind it that showed them why this was so substantial. But this is where, and I know many smarter people than I can distinguish between strategy and execution, but I think that missing part of articulating a strategy is also almost as important, right? It's just, to me, strategy can fall apart when the execution is sort of bland.
Yeah, and I think one of the bridges for that, and we can talk about this later as well, but one of the bridges for that I think is a really easy way to sort of make it easier for everyone to understand strategy is to just include some self-assessment criteria as part of your strategy. So if you're writing a strategy and you're trying to inform content, you're trying to inform creative, you're trying to inform whatever it is, then also including some questions that whoever's actually producing the final work can ask themselves to help them know whether they're in line with your strategy,
Right.
I think is actually a sort of really simple way to think about bridging that gap between strategy and execution. Right. And so maybe you don't have to go all the way to the execution point, but if you at least give the executors a way to simply understand whether they're in line with you or not, it takes away a lot of the sort of fuzzy edges that can exist in the brand positioning that just gets handed over to you, where if you didn't get it explained to you by the people who wrote it, you're just crossing your fingers and hoping that you've interpreted it in the right way.
Interesting. So I'm going to put a little coat on that, and this sort of undermines my earlier argument. Well, so my favorite of those positionings I remember from Gain detergent is smell as proof of clean, right? And so all they have to do at some point in the commercial or in the thing, just show someone sniffing it and going, right? And that's it. And that's a magical moment, and it's based on an insight that somehow or other smell equals clean, even though it's almost ridiculous, right? Mm-hmm. But that's a great articulation of positioning versus, or strategy versus execution. I don't think most people are smart enough to get there.
Yeah.
I'm not. I need the language, the consumer-facing language, the employee-facing language that helps everybody focus. Those questions that you ask are probably good too, and maybe that would solve the problem that I have. But okay, we talked about the past. I think we should take a break and sort of get to a little bit of the present, but not too much. Okay, we'll be right back. Did you know that Renegade Thinkers Unite was ranked number 2 of the top 10 podcasts for CMOs by Crackerjack Marketing? Wow, we're really honored. Now, we couldn't do that without amazing guests, and we've had some amazing CMOs on this show, and also terrific listeners like you all. If you like what we do here, please subscribe on your favorite podcast player. That way, you'll never miss an episode. Also, as a special thanks, I'd like to send you a free ebook on Renegade Thinkers. Now, for that, just email drew@renegade.com. Now let's get back to the show. Okay, we're back, and my guest is Noah Brier, who was the founder and CEO and CTO of Percolate. We talked about your experience at Naked. By the way, I have a little Naked story. They called us a couple of years after you had been there and said, hey, would you execute something for us? And this is when it really hit home that the difference between strategy and execution. If you haven't executed something, you really don't know whether it can be done or not. And they asked us to do one thing, and we had done something like it, but it really wasn't practical. I mean, not even practical. It wasn't doable, but they had it on their plan. So anyway, after Naked, you went to...
The Barbarian Group.
Right, the Barbarian Group. And what did you learn there?
Sure, yeah. So after Naked, after doing the strategy thing, I wanted to get my hands dirty again. That was basically, coming from working at an agency where we made lots of stuff to working at an agency where we made nothing. Right. I wanted to find something in the middle. So I started the strategy department there. They were a digital agency focused on doing sort of lots of really interesting creative digital work. They're most famous for doing Subservient Chicken, right. Which is obviously a sort of seminal piece of digital marketing.
It was. Yeah.
And a lot of my work there, I was there at the time, I think around 2008, 2009, when content was really starting to pick up. So I think my sort of two biggest experiences there were working with two very different kinds of companies, Red Bull and GE.
Right.
And so on one side, I spent probably a month in Austria with Red Bull. We were rebuilding redbull.com. I came to realize that Red Bull is not really a soda company. They're a media company that sells soda. I also came to realize one of the sort of biggest conversations I've had about Red Bull when people ask is to say, I don't know that there's anything anyone can learn from that company. They're so unique and so strange that unless you're owned by a billionaire and you're private, and the billionaire really, really likes fast cars and skydiving, that maybe there's just not so many lessons in there to take away. They're a really unique organization and fascinating and obviously incredibly successful. I mean,
and let's talk about that for a second, because I was thinking about this notion of best practices, and I was realizing that as I was thinking about it, I went, you know what? That's the stupidest notion in the world. If you're trying to be unique, you have to do stuff that other people aren't. So if you look at the best practices, you might as well understand them and then just forget them and say, this is who we are. This is how we operate. And I remember a story from one of my interviews for the book with a knight of the English court. And he said it wasn't until he stopped looking at his competition that he started to succeed. And I thought, okay, that's really interesting. He just started to be unique. Okay, so Barbarian Group, you did Red Bull. You also did GE, which GE did amazing things.
Yeah, and so that was a really amazing project. We worked directly with Beth Comstock, who was the CMO at the time, and then Linda Boff, who's now the CMO.
Right.
And really worked on finding their voice. And I got to do one of the most fun projects in my entire career, which was I went around GE and I was a roving reporter. I basically blogged as a way to help them find their voice.
Right.
And I visited a whole bunch of locations. I talked to a bunch of people. My rule was don't tell me anything secret because I'm going to say it all publicly. But the point of the blog was not actually to get attention to it.
Right.
It was to help them find the voice that they had. And it really worked. And it was fascinating. It was amazing. And then we started producing a lot of content for GE. And the experience I had was they said, this is awesome. Let's do like 4 times more of it next year. And we said, that's awesome. That's going to be 4 times the price because that's sort of how it works. And they were like,
not so much.
Yeah. And that was one of those moments for me where I said, well, this is just not going to work over the long term, right? Like all these brands are very focused on sort of finding new ways to communicate. The amount of content they're producing is increasing. We can have a whole conversation about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's just a fact.
True.
And it certainly was a fact in 2008 when they were producing basically nothing.
Right.
And there are no tools available that really help you in the upfront part of creating marketing. That all the technology that exists even now, and certainly existed when we started Percolate in 2011, was really focused on what I call the last mile. So it was like, CMSs, email marketing, all these things where they assume that like the hardest part of marketing is just how do I deliver this to someone, not what am I saying?
Right.
How do I produce it?
Right. So there's an emphasis on, certainly quantity became a big issue in the business. All right, we're jumping to Percolate. I remember you and James talking about starting this company. I was at one of those like-mind breakfasts, and you introduced me to James, and he seemed like sort of the anti-Noah. He was like the opposite of you in so many ways, which I credit you. And you think about forming a company, you don't want to form it with somebody like yourself. He's, not that you're not, he's outgoing and a salesperson, and you're cerebral and think about things really deeply. How important was that initial, just connecting with someone who was so different from you?
Well, I think we have a lot more in common than most people realize. And I think sometimes James and I like to play those roles because sometimes it goes over well.
Right.
But, I think there's a lot of situations where I'm actually very outgoing. And there's some situations where I actually sort of prefer to be more outgoing.
Right.
I love to get up in front of people and talk. And on the flip side, he's very cerebral, and we have a lot of really interesting conversations. So I think that, there's a funny thing there, which
so
is
I'm making up this difference.
No, I think that there's kind of 2 important things there. One is that, yes, it was really important that we have very different skill sets.
Okay.
And we're focused in different places. And I think in starting a company, you want to have sort of as little operational overlap as possible, right? Because you want to have clear lines of delineation between what you do. And really, our overlap is marketing. Right. So, that's the place where we overlap. He's been focused in sales and go-to-market and all those things, and I had been focused at that point very much in product. I built the initial version of Percolate, but our overlap was marketing and thinking about marketing and thinking about marketers and thinking about the problem of marketers. I think that's the first thing. But yeah, the second is you sometimes it's good to play the roles that you're given, and there's some situations where that's really valuable. And then on the flip side, I have this memory, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's worthwhile. Is I got invited to GE one time to have this sort of amazing meeting. They were talking about the future of employment. They invited like 10 of us. There was a historian, Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Oh my God,
in the room.
I love her. Read many of her books.
There was a business professor. Wow. I was the millennial.
Right.
And we were having this conversation about the future of the workforce and employees and how to connect better with new types of people. And about 2 hours in, someone from GE stood up and said, "Hey, everybody, just pause for a second. Everybody stop playing their roles. Stop being the historian. Stop being the business professor. Stop being the millennial. And just, like, be a smart person. That's what you are. Like, bring your experiences in. But, like, everybody quit being the thing that they're supposed to be."
Wow.
Which, I thought it's something I think about a lot. I think about it in running workshops. I think about it in doing brainstorming, any of those things. It's like, sometimes you do have to break those rules. Sometimes it's good to play them, and you play them to make everybody more comfortable and feel better. And sometimes it's really helpful to flip out of that, right?
All right. Next brainstorming, I'm playing the intern. All right. So here's one thing you just sort of blew right by is you wrote the first product version of Percolate. You did the code. How did you teach yourself to learn to code?
Yeah, so while I was at Naked, I taught myself to code. I just was interested. I was tired of asking people to build things for me, so I became a pretty crappy coder, to be honest. But while I was there, I built a little experiment that actually came from a conversation I had with a friend. He had invited me to come talk to him, talk to his company, and he asked me to come talk about brand versus utility. And I was like, sure, I'll come talk about brand versus utility. I don't really know what that means, but let me spend some time thinking about it, and I'll come talk. And sometimes I think about this a lot. Like, sometimes you learn the most when you're given a brief, right? That is just totally outside of an area that you would otherwise explore. And so I went in and I did all this research. I learned about utility theory and economics, and I basically came back to him and I said, well, I don't actually think there's a distinction. They were a big media company, and they were trying to figure out, is the brand more important or is the product more important? Mm. And I said, well, utility is actually, it's a measure of the relative satisfaction somebody has from the consumption of goods, right? That's utility in sort of economics terms. So that's kind of interesting. But what is satisfaction? Satisfaction is actually a function of expectations, right? Your satisfaction level is partly a function of what you expected to receive out of it. If you have low expectations, your satisfaction might be higher. Right. If you had really high expectations, somebody can be amazing. A product can be absolutely extraordinary, but it didn't reach it, and therefore it's disappointing.
It's like going to a movie that everybody's hyped, and this is the best movie ever, and you go, oh, wasn't that good? Right. Because it was
the second best movie ever.
Right.
And so, what is the point of marketing and branding but to set expectations? And so I said to them, I had this thought. I said, well, I don't really think you can draw a hard line between those things. I don't think that brand and utility, and this is still something I think about a lot, and I think people love to draw that distinction. They love to talk about it. But I think this is part of what makes measuring marketing so hard, is that it's really hard to say where the brand begins and the products end, right? Because
it is, although if you talk to the folks at Wells Fargo, they can tell you very much what happens when you lose brand.
Yes.
I mean, and because brand equals trust, and with a bank, financial institution, if you lose trust, you lose pretty much everything. Frankly, almost every brand. When you lose trust, you lose everything. But the difference between pre-crisis and post, in terms of the value of the stock, the perceptions, it's huge. Nothing really changed from a utility standpoint. But everything changed in terms of a brand standpoint. Right.
And so I was working on this presentation, and one night I had this idea that popped in my head, which was, well, if you believe all these things and sort of, brands ultimately are about setting expectations, then what if I just flashed up a random logo and people typed in the first thing that popped into their head, and I made a tag cloud out of it? That would be kind of a snapshot of brand perception. So I got up. This was one of these. I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning and I just made it, and I sort of put it out in the world the next day, and some people started to like it, and then some people started to write about it, and then it was in the Wall Street Journal, and then it was in Ad Age, and it was in all these things, and I got to be on NPR, which was probably the most amazing of all the experiences, because NPR cuts all your ums and ahs.
Oh, isn't that nice?
Oh, my God.
We don't do that on this show. I'm sorry.
It's okay. So you sound absolutely brilliant when you come off NPR. But I built brand tags, and brand tags was this super fun experiment, and it caught a lot of attention. I collected something like 15 million tags. And I also caught the bug for building products. And I saw this thing go, and I taught myself to write code, and then I had to maintain it, and then people were breaking it, and I had to find ways to fix it. And so, you learn a lot when you're forced to.
Right.
And I was forced to learn a lot. And so I built brand tags. I ended up selling it, I think 2 years after that. And that also gave me a little bit of seed money to not be paid for a while we started Percolate.
I got it. All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about a number of things that you're going to want to listen to. So stay with us.
You've been listening to another great interview on Renegade Thinkers Unite with Drew Neiser. But the value doesn't end there. As a listener, you can download a free ebook from Drew, Renegade Thinkers, interviews with 11 trailblazing CMOs any business can learn from. Top marketing thought leaders and proven executives from Time Warner, American Express, and Chico's, and others. Get your free copy at renegadethinkersunite.com/ebook. For listeners only at renegadethinkersunite.com/ebook.
So we're back, and my guest is Noah Brier, who was the founder of Percolate. And I want to make a point for any of the students that are listening to the show. If you want to know whether or not you're an entrepreneur, you probably will see it in your behavior early on. I want to just sort of share a few things that Noah has said or hasn't said. Noah had a blog when he was in college for the Chicago Bears. He just mentioned the fact that he taught himself to program while he had another job and built this tag cloud thing. There was an entrepreneurial spark. In many ways, you are more a Gen Z. You're like the side gig kid, right? Which is what Gen Z is all about. Anyway, none of this is surprising to me because this is the Noah that I saw that we wanted to hire. This was someone who went above and beyond because you were curious about so many things and you just pursued them. You did them. So if you think you want to be an entrepreneur, start being an entrepreneur. It's like if you want to be a writer, you better be writing.
Can I say one more thing about
Please.
this? Because I teach a class every year at the University of Montana, and I'm generally sort of wary of advice because I worry about it. I don't love advice myself, but the one thing I always say, and this actually goes back to Renegade as well, is, and I've had the same experience running my own company, is when you are in your first job or any job really, I think the thing to do is to do your job, do the job that you were hired for, get it done, and then go explore. Because nobody's going to stop you from doing other things once you've finished the thing that you were supposed to do. So I had copy to write. I got my copy written. And then I went around and I talked to Tripp and I started working on new business. Or I talked to Tad and I started working on strategy. Or I talked to Fanny and I started working on creative stuff. And nobody is going to turn you down
Not
from
at
helping
all.
them.
No.
And as long as you finish the job you were hired to do, which is the piece that I think a lot of people want to skip over. They want to skip the job they were hired to do and work on the other things. You can explore a lot of new parts of an organization, and you will get paid for it. And it's great. And you can learn about a whole bunch of new things and try new directions.
Love it. Great advice. We're going to record that, put that on the recruiting site for renegade.com. Do your job, then explore. Okay. I'm curious. Your Percolate is now you've left Percolate and you had 8 years. What do you wish you knew when you started the company that you know now?
Sure, yeah. Wow. There's any number of things. I think, if I look back on my experience at Percolate, we did a lot of things right and we did a lot of things wrong. I think that's what happens. You can't go through the experience of being an entrepreneur and not make a bunch of mistakes. And I think the hope is that you make fewer of them next time. But we also did a lot of things right. I think that there's a lot of stuff around culture that both we did right and then we did wrong, and that I take away and I think about, and I think as I go into starting a new company, I'm really want to make sure that we get right. Culture is incredibly powerful. That I think is sort of something I knew from the beginning. One of the things we did really well was we wrote a lot down. Mm-hmm. And to me, part of it is that I am a writer, but part of it is that I think there's nothing that scales better in an organization than writing, because you can read it across space and time, mm-hmm. right? You can't tell stories verbally and expect them to always carry. So I think investing in culture, especially early on, is really critical. I think one of the really hard things is that as you're growing, and especially as you're growing fast, you bring in a lot of new people,
right.
and they have a lot of ideas about your culture. And some of them are right, and some of them are very wrong. Mm. And learning to understand which ones are right and which ones are wrong is really hard, right? And part of it is that you don't always trust your gut. Mm. And you think that these are people who are coming from really big, really successful companies. But you have to find the balance, and it's hard to say exactly where that balance is. Mm. But I think you have to know in your heart what your culture is, and you have to be able to nail that. Because the thing about culture that is so powerful is that things that are embedded at the cultural level. I've been trying to sort of articulate this as a set of layers, but things that are embedded at the cultural level. It just means that it's stuff you don't have to do in other ways in the organization, right? It's process you don't need to put in place because you've made it culture, right? And culture is so much more powerful than process. And so if you've embedded creativity, you've embedded experimentation, you've embedded agile, if you get it down to that cultural level where it's just a part of the fabric of the organization, then you have to worry less about making sure that you have the agile process nailed because you have an agile culture.
And so part of that then is hiring into that, right? People who are naturally inclined to those things, and then training people who don't. One of the things that I was surprised, I interviewed Diana O'Brien, who's the global CMO of Deloitte, and she talked about their Deloitte University and how they could teach empathy. I thought, I thought that was something you had to hire for. She said, no, we teach people that. And I thought, that's fascinating. So part A is hiring into culture, defining culture, and then hiring into culture, and then acculturating.
Yeah. I've always sort of struggled with the hiring into culture thing, actually. I think that to some extent, my worry with talking about culture fit is that it ends up meaning a lot of the same people.
Right.
And sort of moves you away from diversity.
Right.
I think that to some extent, people, if you've defined the culture well enough, then people can adapt to it, and you want different views and you want different opinions. And so I actually was very sort of purposeful in not making culture fit a part of it.
Right.
I think if you hire smart people who want to be there, startups are nice because there's a certain amount of self-selection. Somebody has to be willing to take a risk to join a 20, a 50, 100-person company in a way that they don't when they go to join Deloitte. And so, you sort of get rid of a whole bunch of people who don't want to be there. And then from there, people figure it out. And if your culture is strong enough, then it ideally able to take those people in, and the culture should adapt over time, right? So one of the really important things is that culture can't stay stagnant. One of the things we did is we revisited our values yearly. I think a lot of companies think about values being something that are set in stone.
Right.
But why should anything be set in stone, right? Why shouldn't you look at your values and question whether they're still something you're living, right? Because again, culture is the things that you actually do.
Right.
Your values are the things you say you do. And so, making sure those two things are connected is really critical. And so revisiting them, I think, is a powerful mechanism for making that happen.
So culture was one big thing. In values you mentioned. What was sort of one other thing that you wish you knew at the beginning of starting Percolate?
Sure. I think that, on hiring, one of the big important things is, so as you're growing a company really quick, especially as you're a first-time entrepreneur, everybody says you got to hire people who have been there before.
Right.
And so you talk to all these people from all these really big companies, and ideally you hire a couple of them. But when you hire people from really big successful companies, they often have misinterpreted what the company did for why it's successful, right? It's a correlation causation problem.
Sure.
So, this is famous for people who hire from Google, where, people have come to believe, especially people who've worked at Google for a long time, that the way Google operates is what makes it successful. And that might be true, but it's really hard to tell because Google has a money printing machine.
Right. Exactly. Yes, we should all have that. Where you have a monopoly on something where you don't have to create really anything other than the search and you're living off of the world of content.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant model.
And so you have to be really careful when you say, Google is successful because they offer really good lunch.
Yeah.
Right? And that's how they attract talent.
Right.
Or Google is successful because it has 20% time, which I think is a thing a lot of people took away as an innovative idea for how companies should operate. But there's just a real question of, like, can you do that if you're not Google? And I think there's a whole generation of startups that kind of collapsed under their own weight because they took the wrong things away from these really successful companies.
I love that you pointed that out, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to do a part 2 of this episode, and we're going to wrap this up. There's a couple of things. So one, Google was printing money so they could afford to do something like 20%. Most companies aren't in that position, so the notion of copying it is kind of silly. Famous fund manager, the Magellan Fund at Fidelity, Peter, what's his name? Anyway, said, beware of the next anything, right? Beware the next Walmart, beware the next, because anybody who was copying that model is going to fail. The last thing I sort of wanted to say on that one is I remember when I was at an account executive at JWT, and we were working on the Warner Lambert business. We had Listerine, which was the only product that actually was number 1 in the category that P&G competed in. Scope was number 2. Well, they hired a guy from P&G, and it was the worst thing ever because, well, this is the way we did it at P&G. Well, by the way, Listerine is number 1 in the category. We don't care what Scope did. It's not relevant. And he really was sort of a virus that got expelled from the organization because, but he couldn't leave. It wasn't about P&G.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and, we can get into this in part 2, but this is very much in line with Byron Sharp's ideas from How Brands Grow about market share and being top in the category really being the biggest driver of success.
Right. Okay, we're gonna wrap this one up. So a couple of things. I think this is really the entrepreneur episode. I want to sort of let you hear what a true entrepreneur sounds like, and the behavior of the individual is really important here. That you don't just accidentally come into these things. You work at them and you develop it through a career. So anyway, that's 15 years of experience. Noah, thank you for this part, and we'll continue in the next episode.
Thank you very much.
This has been Renegade Thinkers Unite, but it doesn't end there. Just go to renegadethinkersunite.com for more and subscribe to the show. That way, you'll never miss an episode. We'll talk with you next time on Renegade Thinkers Unite.